Well, thank you for having me on. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Saeed Khan. I'm a senior lecturer in Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies at Wayne State University in Detroit, where I'm also the Director of Global Studies and a research fellow at the Center for Study of Citizenship there. Very grateful for ISPU's invitation to be part of this really wonderful series of Wisdom Wednesdays. Just full disclosure on ISPU, I was one of the co-founders of ISPU many, many moons ago. I came up with the idea after 9/11 that there was a real need for the Muslim American narrative to not only be represented, but also to do a deeper dive into understanding the Muslim American community and the way that social and domestic policy issues not only pertain to them, but what was their perspective in being able to contribute to the broader American narrative. Now, as far as the nature of my work, most of my research is really an intersection of the Muslim American community, but more broadly, what I like to do is take a look at, through the lens of global studies, what is particularly the development of the so-called West. The Western world, and especially when it comes to Muslim communities that are living in there, is a fascinating area of study. And I find, particularly with my coursework as well as my research, that in many ways, the so-called Western world is really understudied and not really understood very well by people living in the West itself. And that could either be by Muslims themselves, many of them who are immigrants, but not, of course, all, as well as the West itself, and understanding how did it get to this point. And of course, here we are in the climate of the current pandemic, and there are an awful lot of different issues, anxieties, concerns that people have on how to address it, how to deal with it. But I find that taking a longer and broader historical arc, and being a historian by trade and by discipline, I find it really interesting to see then how, when we take a look at the cultural history, the political history, the economic history, the intellectual history of trying to understand this thing that we call the West, its diversities, its complexities, its contradictions. I find that to be extremely helpful, and then locating particularly the work that ISPU does within that to provide a better understanding and clarity, not only for, again, the Muslim American communities, but also perhaps to help the West gain a better understanding of itself. So, how does that necessarily relate to my interest in Islamic bioethics? Well, I think first of all, it might be helpful to provide a bit of a definition of what is Islamic bioethics. Essentially, it is what it sounds like. It is an Islamic perspective or a directive on issues that are both ethical and moral, and particularly within the fields of scientific and technological disciplines. How do we then understand the awesome changes that both scientific progress as well as technological progress are bringing to the world today, and providing then the injection, or at least the lens, through an Islamic perspective? How can Muslims go ahead and engage with these changes? And oftentimes these changes are ones that are brought to the Muslim world, so to speak, and to Muslim communities, as opposed to them necessarily having the agency, the voice, or a full and robust sense of input in being able to contribute to them. And we find, of course, that this is something that is not a recent phenomenon. It has been going on, well, basically for the last couple of centuries, beginning with the colonial era. And when colonization hit the Muslim world, we find then that the kind of impact that it had was manifold. On the one hand, it was simply the imposition of values that were then befalling the communities, but also it was the taking of resources, and particularly the taking of narrative and identity of these communities. So when we take a look now at the pace of change that's coming about when it comes to science and progress, it's important to then try to recognize and maybe even extrapolate how are these issues going to affect Muslim communities. Now, at the same time, it also has to be understood that scientific progress is happening at a rate and at a pace that perhaps is even too quick for those who are producing this kind of information and this kind of know-how and technology. And as a result of it, those very important questions that oftentimes used to occur concurrently to the development of new technologies and new scientific breakthroughs don't have that kind of luxury anymore. So what we would consider to be the philosophical questions, the pondering of what's going to be the ethical and the moral impact on societies, on individuals and communities, doesn't seem to have the ability to occur. Now, 1,000 years ago, when Islam was really the zeitgeist, and it was responsible for, if not itself, producing so much of the incredible knowledge in so many different fields, but also encouraging and inspiring that in those who were not themselves Muslim, there was the ability for scientists, theologians, philosophers to get together and to oftentimes deliberate, debate, and contemplate what was going to be the impact of this new innovation that was being created. That's something that we recognize not only do we have the ability to do, but perhaps we need to return to not just the spirit, but also the methodology by which we then tackle some of these very profound issues that are happening. So when we take a look at Islamic bioethics, it is the recognition then of how, first and foremost, we see the impact on human beings of some of these new technologies and scientific breakthroughs. And all of this comes down to an understanding of the Sharia or Islamic law, principles and authorities which govern the lives, the livelihoods, and the societies in which Muslims interact. And there are 5 major purposes that occur when it comes to the Sharia, or what are known as the maqasid al-Sharia, the purposes. And these all have to do with protection and preservation of certain important qualities. One, of course, is the hifz ad-din, the protection and the preservation of the faith. There's the hifz al-nafs, the protection and the preservation of life itself. There's the hifz al-aql, the protection and preservation of intelligence, intellect, even sanity. There is the hifz al-nasl, which is the protection and the preservation of procreation or lineage, the ability for human beings to keep their species going forward. And then there's the hifz al-mal, which is the protection and the preservation of property, and even if you want to go ahead and define it as wealth. Now, all of these are important protections. All of these are noble protections if done properly and in a lawful way. And these then form the cement or the pillars of what is the purpose not only of law, but how we then have to always use these as a checklist when it comes to understanding ethical and moral principles, as well as impact and consequences of, in this particular area, scientific and technological progress. So the question then becomes, how does Islamic bioethics relate to a field that I have, over the last 3 years particularly, become fascinated with seeing, because it seems to be the new future, the new brave or unbrave new world in which we are going to have to interact. And that is with artificial intelligence, or sometimes known as machine learning or machine intelligence. So before we go any further, let me go ahead, if you will allow me, to provide some kind of definition of what we mean by artificial intelligence. Now, of course, it sounds like in some ways a very exotic term, something that was before this just the exclusive province of science fiction novels or movies. But artificial intelligence is something with which we already interact. It could be something as simple as an app on one's phone or laptop, or the way that artificial intelligence is something which is already occurring with our computers, or with which we interact at work, at school, or in any other kind of capacity. Basically what it is having something other than a human being doing the thinking for us. And so again, one could have said that a primitive form of artificial intelligence was even a calculator. Now, of course, we have far more advanced forms of technology to do that. But within the area of artificial intelligence, it's more important to take a look at the trajectory that we are underway and what artificial intelligence may end up doing. On the one hand, of course, there is this very important component of automation. When we think of AI, we think of robots, we think of non-human, non-organic species that are conducting acts and operations that until now were primarily, if not exclusively, performed by human beings. But when it comes to the idea of thinking, this is another very important aspect of it. Of course, when we think about artificial intelligence, we are still within the realm of thinking that this is still a creation of a human being, a programmer who will then go ahead with a series of algorithms, instill within whatever is the device the ability to think, and that will then be the limitations of and the parameters of what that AI is able to go ahead and do. Can it think beyond what it is programmed to do? And we'll talk about how this is a very important issue to consider as well. So when we're looking then at AI, and as we're looking at some of the speed and pace by which AI is coming online, so to speak, we also have to be very conscious about whether AI will develop its own consciousness. And as a result of that, as I'll talk about in a bit, we need to then go ahead and be vigilant about these directions and these particular trajectories. My interest in AI actually began in a very, very improbable way. A few years ago, I was invited to MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The MIT Media Lab was holding a one-day seminar on what they called forbidden research. And I was invited to be part of a discussion on Islam and human rights, particularly as they pertain to women. But there was a panel that came right after mine, which was about pleasure robots and how these robots were being designed to wean pedophiles away from their natural impulses of assaulting and molesting young children. And the way that the panelists were describing this was that these robots were in fact made to look like children as a way to then serve as a diversion and a distraction for these pedophiles. Well, needless to say, this was something that was a complete shock to me to hear about even their existence. But it evoked in me thoughts of what were the implications of this. What did it say about our society? First of all, that we had to even contemplate something of this sort, but then what were going to be the implications and the consequences of this? And particularly as a Muslim, I started to think about what would be the Islamic ethical issues behind this, and perhaps more importantly, what would be the importance of the Islamic bioethical input into the discussion about these things. What I noticed as a result of my experience with the MIT seminar was that there were a couple of major fault lines. One was that there weren't enough people in the room representing the different areas and disciplines that would be impacted on this. By and large, it was a discussion that was happening with a couple of tech people, and there was somebody there who was speaking from a legal background. But when it comes to AI, there needs to be a discussion that involves theologians, philosophers, economists, political scientists, of course, tech experts, historians to provide a longer historical arc view of things. Several different voices need to be in a deliberative process to try to then understand what's going on. As a result of this absence, I then had to go ahead and think about who would be the most important, if we can even go ahead and say that, who should be in the room during this discussion. When it comes to AI, I realized that the serious philosophical questions, the serious ethical questions, generally then are within the domain, if not exclusively so, then in many cases primarily so, in the hands of philosophers and theologians. and yet there was nobody there who was speaking within that register. Now, one of the positive points that I noticed from this experience was the true desire of the creators of this kind of technology, the tech people, wanting to engage with all of these other individuals, which shows then that there is a limit to what we might think as living in an ivory tower, in a bubble, whatever metaphor you want to use, and more importantly, understanding that they have the humility to recognize the awesome potential and perhaps misuse and abuse of this kind of technology. So there is a desire on the part of the tech world to engage with people who can then provide these circuit breakers, if you will, when it comes to the ethical issues and the moral issues. And they are not discriminating when it comes to excluding a particular religious tradition or persuasion from having a seat at the table. So all the more reason then that the input has to be there from communities, especially the Muslim community, which represents something close to 1/4 of all of humanity on the planet, to have an impact and an input within these kinds of conversations, particularly when it comes to the ethical and the moral constructs. That and the fact that Muslims have, with their very gloried past, a history and a legacy with Islamic civilization being the generator of so much technological and scientific progress, that there are the metrics, the mechanics, as well as the ideological underpinnings to be able to contribute without having to, and apologize for the metaphor here, reinvent the wheel. So one of the goals that I have is to try to go ahead and organize a convening of sorts when it comes to getting everybody into the proverbial room to have these discussions with one another. Now, one of the limitations of this is language itself and terminology. Part of the problem is that many within the philosophical and the theological world are unfamiliar with the technological language that is used by those who are creating the technology. And similarly, those who are within the tech world may not necessarily have the kind of familiarity with economics, with the anthropology, with the political and the legal issues that are involved. So the idea of then having a cross-pollinating, multidisciplinary convening is paramount. And there have been some efforts that have been underway, but none have really been complete. So perhaps, and certainly in this current climate of COVID-19 and people having these kinds of discussions about what is the future once we emerge from this wormhole of coronavirus, what and how is the world going to change? Well, one of the things that's certainly going to be waiting for us on the other side is going to be these advancements in science and technology. So how then can we contribute an ethical compass to that? So within that, I wouldn't mind to have then the ability to bring people together, as well then producing on a regular basis position papers, as well as collaborations long-term with these various disciplines as we move forward. So the question then becomes, why Islamic bioethics? What are the particular issues with AI to consider? So let me go ahead and map out a few. Let's say, for example, that there is AI, and the AI has the ability at a certain point to calculate with blazing speed all of the permutations of various calculations and all. There is, as many scientists are now predicting, going to come a point where AI will, for lack of better terms, develop its own self-awareness, its own consciousness, and move beyond the algorithms in which it has already been provided. So if that occurs and it breaks free of what human beings can predict it having the ability to do, what does that mean then? That there's going to be another entity, AI, that has sentient thought, something which until this point, human beings would have thought is really their exclusive domain. How is that going to impact the way that we interact with AI? Will AI then be considered worthy of, eligible of, qualifying for what we would consider personhood. Well, personhood is a fascinating concept because until now, those who defined personhood were exclusively theologians and philosophers. These were the two communities who could then go ahead and tell you that if you define a human being or a person, an insan, if you will, they have to have certain qualities, they have to have certain characteristics. A soul. Well, what does a soul mean? That is going to have to then be clarified perhaps even further, and it is going to then have to be a very important definition in then interacting with AI. What does it mean then to be aware or self-aware or self-conscious? The French philosopher René Descartes said very famously, cogito ergo sum, meaning I think, therefore I am. Well, if being, ontology, is based on the ability to think, does that mean that an AI that is thinking on its own, self-aware, even beyond its own original algorithm, does that mean that it also is? These are questions that right now are also being considered, but need to be also considered from an Islamic perspective. What does it mean then that once something has personhood or has been defined as having personhood, how do we relate to it? What are its rights? What are its responsibilities? Do AI have the ability, or should they have the ability to have citizenship? If they do, what are the consequences of that? What about having a relationship that is by contract with AI? So these kinds of issues have ethical and moral dimensions, and the Islamic tradition has a tremendous level of contribution that it can make to these things. What about the issue of consent? Can, for example, AI refuse to accept a command that is given by a human being to do something that would otherwise be haram for a human being to do, something that would be unlawful, either a sin or something that is criminal? One example of this is what would be the use of AI in a military capacity. This is something that is already underway when it comes to drone technology, when it comes to other advanced missile systems. What if, for example, AI is allowed to take over and to conduct combat missions, something that if a human being were involved would constitute a war crime? Would this provide immunization for human liability, allowing then machines to do what they want and for us to then claim that we are exempt from any kind of accountability? In a sense, transferring sin, transferring criminality just because something happens to not be a human being. These are profound questions that need to be asked as well. What about the ability of AI to refuse what it would then consider to be an unlawful, or for lack of better terms, a sinful command that is being given to it? Do AI have the ability, and should they have the right to refuse such commands? Should they have the right to go ahead and refuse an upgrade to their software? Do human beings have the responsibility to optimize the software, both in an ethical way as well as in an operational way for AI? Or are we allowed to, as the creators of AI, keep it stupid, ignorant, and dependent on human beings? And this notion of using the word creator is also extremely important, particularly from an Islamic standpoint. What does it mean then for human beings to create technology which will be so advanced, which in many ways would replicate that which human beings themselves would be able to do, and perhaps even more efficiently and optimally than human beings will do? That in itself brings about some very profound theological questions. But not just from the standpoint of wayward AI, renegade and rebellious AI. I don't want people to think necessarily just through the lens of your favorite science fiction movie or television show or novel, whether it is Terminator or Ex Machina or AI or I Am Legend, and any number of other movies and how these might pertain. There's also some other very practical things that even today we can see the impact of AI already having a role. What does it mean, for example, to automate a society to the point where it's making human beings redundant? If it's a matter of some kind of bottom line for a corporation, some profit margin, or optimization of a dividend, what about the human dignity to have a job, to be able to provide a livelihood for him or herself, as well as for him or her family? One example is this. Supposing, for example, that in the Persian Gulf, let's say in Dubai, there are the introduction of self-driving taxis, something which is already underway with the sale of self-driving cars for Uber to Dubai. If in the next decade, for example, Uber self-driving taxis are available exclusively as the means of transportation around Dubai, what is going to be the ripple effect? Now, the entire fleet of Uber cars now in Dubai is run by foreign workers, those coming from places in the Indian subcontinent, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Philippines, Indonesia as well. They are there as migrant workers because the economic conditions within their own countries respectively probably is not conducive enough to allow them to support themselves and their families financially. Therefore, they endure in many ways not just separation from family, but indignities and poor conditions while living in a place like Dubai. Now, let's say for the sake of argument that within a decade, the entire fleet of taxis becomes self-driving. That means, arguably, that the entire taxi fleet that currently is there, all of the thousands of migrant workers, are going to be made redundant. And most likely, because that would be their only immediate means of justifying their work permit, their redundancy would mean deportation. They would have to be deported back to their countries of origin, countries where already the economic conditions are not there to sustain them adequately. What will be then the ripple effect in some of these countries? What will it say for economic stability? What will it say for political stability? What will it say, as I said before, for the dignity of individuals? And when we take a look then at the Maqasid al-Sharia, when we take a look at, for example, the protection and the preservation, the hifz al-mal, the protection of property, the various kinds of safeguards and ethical imperatives that are built into Sharia. Should these then be considered by policymakers in places like Dubai, as well as many other governments, as to the impact that this is going to have with these kinds of technological advancements? We here in the United States are already seeing these kinds of consequential decision-making issues when it comes to automation in factories, when it comes to decisions about closing factories because of more robotics coming in. What is that going to mean for entire sectors of society? 2 years ago, Oxford University issued a report in which they predicted that 40% of current jobs will be made redundant by artificial intelligence and automation within the next 10 years. Now, that's not just jobs within manufacturing. It's predicted that every sector of society is going to be affected by this, whether it is healthcare, both in a positive way as well as in a negative way. The legal profession is also going to be affected by this. So when we see this kind of wholesale impact on societies, what then is that going to mean for what is perhaps the most important purpose of Sharia and of Islam as a whole? Having functional, stable societies. We see right now with the global pandemic what are the issues and the consequences of something that has nothing to do with AI, the kind of disruption that it is bringing about, the kind of speculation as to whether these kinds of changes are going to be permanent and irreversible once the immediate threat of COVID-19 is subsided. So when we're taking a look at these profound questions, it is then imperative for us to then see how this, the notion of AI, particularly from an ethical perspective, has to be studied and with which it has to be engaged. Now, what do I find to be perhaps the reason for a certain level of urgency in considering this, and particularly for there to be the need for Muslim input? Well, one of them, as I said before, that with 1.8 billion Muslims around the world, there is an essential nature for then Muslims and the Muslim narrative and voice and input to be provided, given the fact that there is going to be such an impact on such a large segment of humanity. On top of that, there is also the issue of the instabilities that we're seeing in the world today. The kind of disruption that COVID-19 has provided is an insight into what can be two of the next most profound major changes which are already predicted. By 2043, the United States is predicted to develop what is going to be known as a majority-minority population, meaning that for the first time in US history, the sum total of the population will be majority something other than the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant current majority. And this is already happening on regional levels currently. And as we see, some of the major so-called cultural anxieties or moral panics are already starting to set in. When we talk about nativism, xenophobia, anti-immigration, anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic views, when we see some of the racial rhetoric that is underway, the hostility by which this is happening is in many ways due to the kinds of anxieties because of an uncertain and unpredictable future in the world when it comes to economic uncertainty, political uncertainty, cultural uncertainty. All of these then do not bode well for the kind of stability that is required for functional societies. Now, some predict that that date of 2043 may be a little bit too conservative. By current birth rate levels and all, it could occur even earlier, maybe as soon as 2040. There's also a prediction that by the year 2045, that the world will achieve what's known as technological singularity, that point where human intelligence and artificial intelligence will finally converge, and from that point, artificial intelligence will rise exponentially at a faster rate than human intelligence. So if AI is going to be then the dominant intelligence in the world, how is that going to affect human beings? How are human beings going to feel about either the threat of being made redundant in work or in society as a whole, because AI is taking over so many of those tasks, but also the psychological impact, the ethical and the moral impact of taking orders from not just AI, but from things that we have ourselves created. So all of these then create, if you will, a landscape that needs to be addressed, that needs to be acknowledged, and with which it needs to be engaged. And Muslims, I think, are in many ways uniquely poised and positioned to be able to provide a tremendous level of input on many of these issues, and for two reasons. Number one, because of the kind of impact they have experienced being on the receiving end of so many profound changes to their way of life, their livelihoods, their well-being, starting with the colonial era after the decline of Muslim civilizational power. And the other reason is because within Islamic civilization's own past, we have this period not only of tremendous knowledge production, but also a template about how those ethical and moral issues were addressed, how they were part of the input when technology was being developed. So if we have these certainly very important components, we can then help move forward with a template that can serve others. But of course, that's going to require, as they say, a lot of heavy lifting. The first and foremost thing is for Muslims to recognize that AI has so many different consequential and impactful components to it. Now, part of that requires, again, moving away from just the exotic nature of things. There are, as I've made reference to movies and others within the scientific era, a certain level of exoticization of it. There's a certain amount of fantasization of it. At the same time, these movies are important not necessarily for the CGI, the graphics, and the special effects, but some of the philosophical questions that they pose. So whether it's a show like Black Mirror on Netflix, which always seems to have important philosophical questions that it asks in each episode, or movies like Blade Runner or Ex Machina and all, it's important for us to look at these critically and ask ourselves, what is being said? What is already being said? And of course, along with that, where's the Muslim voice? So whether that is something that can occur sitting on the couch and engaging in a kind of active viewing session with these kinds of shows, Westworld being another, it's very important to see because someone has obviously already done some of the thinking for us. It would be nice for us to be involved in that process as well. And then the next thing that can happen is to try to find, and in many ways, try to take the lead in convening these kinds of discussions as they go forward. That requires, of course, a better understanding of Islamic bioethics. That requires a better understanding of how the ethical elements of Islam have been already employed when it comes to the historical past. It's one thing to learn about the great achievements of people like al-Biruni, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Ar-Razi in the past, but it would be very interesting to try to interpret what was their thinking when it came to these kinds of technologies. What were the considerations that they made? Why did they perhaps not go further than what they did? That would be a very insightful way for us to then follow a trajectory that has already been established for us, so that we shouldn't then feel daunted or intimidated by our inability or our perceived inability to be able to engage on these issues. So again, how do we then move forward? I would propose taking, interestingly enough, a term from the tech field already. Some of you may be familiar with the term CRISPR, which is an internet-based software that allows scientists from all over the world to come together and help with gene sequencing. And this really took off after the completion of the human genome for the first time in the early 2000s. Well, it could be our task, our responsibility, and our contribution to become an ideas CRISPR, an incubator, if you will, that helps to convene people from these various disciplines and not only be at the table, but maybe even help set the table ourselves to decide who comes in and who can then have an important and contributory role to play. One of the main benefits of doing it this way is that we guarantee that we have a seat at the table. It's like hosting the World Cup in soccer. The host team always has an automatic buy into the tournament. It's the easiest way to get into the tournament, as a matter of fact. Because you don't have to qualify by playing a ton of matches. The other thing, though, that it also guarantees is that the Islamic perspective can be fully and robustly represented. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to come into that space with a sense of superiority or dominance. We have to be very pragmatic and realistic about where our position is when it comes to these very important topics. Yes, we do have the tradition of bioethics that we can offer, but when one takes a look at the so-called Muslim world, when it comes to the issue of artificial intelligence and its production, certainly it is very few and far between. There are scientists who are certainly involved in these processes, but one doesn't really see the Muslim community being at the vanguard, per se, of the kind of technology that is occurring, that is going to have such a profound change on everybody's life and livelihood moving forward. So the understanding that we will not only have to stay in our lane as far as what we have to offer, but recognizing that what we are offering is certainly very, very important. So as we move forward then in taking a look at the intersection of Islamic bioethics with AI, it is one of those questions that we can always ask ourselves, because in many ways, Muslims are already hardwired to ask these questions when it comes to their daily actions. The whole notion of being able to enjoin the good and prohibit and forbid the bad is something that everyone learns from the very earliest inceptions of Sunday school, and then becomes ingrained as a checklist and a manner by which we're able to discern the world around us. So when it comes to technology, similarly, we can go ahead and do that. And perhaps most importantly, we can offer that and share that with others, especially at a time when there is willingness by those who are creating this technology to want to learn how's their driving. Are they doing the right thing? Are they going too fast? Are they going in the wrong direction? Many of you are probably familiar with the movie Jurassic Park. The original is, can you believe it, 27 years old now, 1993. And perhaps one of the most profound scenes in that movie is not all the CGI with all the dinosaurs, but it's a scene around another table, lunch with Dr. Hammond, where people are now discussing, debating, philosophizing the very project that is his pride and joy and his baby. And the wisdom comes about from the mathematician sitting there who's asking these questions about, you went ahead and you put this technology together, you didn't create it yourself, you borrowed it from others. And of course, there's a very strong pushback from Dr. Hammond, who says, well, no, look, this is something good. And Jeff Goldblum's character, Ian Malcolm, says, no, you spent all your time wondering if you could. You never stopped to think whether you should. And in many ways, when we take a look at Islamic bioethics and we take a look at technology, this is one of many questions that needs to be asked. It's not the only question. And we find that in many ways, Islam's relationship and engagement with science has been far more, dare I use this word, progressive than have other religious traditions. We have not had within the Islamic tradition the kind of abuse that Galileo faced from the church when he dared to go ahead and offer that the sun did not revolve around the earth, that in fact it was the earth that revolved around the sun. There was no branding of heresy in the same way that we see in other religious traditions around the world, which shows then a tremendous capacity for Islam to go ahead and reconcile science, technology, progress with its ethical and moral constructs. Having said that, it's also important to recognize that while we're not necessarily stuck between this binary of lawful and unlawful, halal and haram, there are other shades on the spectrum. And it's important then to offer, in a qualified way, a cost-benefit analysis way, a risk versus benefits way. What then are the ways that we proceed with this kind of technology? So wrapping up then, I think it's important for us to see that this is an inevitability, and as from an Islamic perspective, anything is free of virtue signaling. It is a test. AI is not necessarily going to be per se bad or per se good. It is not going to be the savior. It's not going to be what condemns and consigns humanity to its own oblivion. But it's important to recognize that it needs to be something with which we engage moving forward, and particularly if there already is a pre-existing and well-established ethical and moral compass, a checklist that we can then use and employ moving forward. That could in fact be perhaps our great contribution in the 21st century. Well, if anyone would like to contact me with any questions, feel free to do so through ISPU. You can also reach me on Facebook, on Instagram. I guess these are the new technologies of the day, or simply with an email at s.khan, Khan, at Wayne, WAYNE.edu. Again, I'd like to thank ISPU for allowing me the opportunity to share with you on Wisdom Wednesdays. And I also want to thank you for tuning in to ISPU's Wisdom Wednesdays. And I hope that you continue to do so for the fine work that they also do. Again, thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.